Okay, so comply or explain is just the fact that the ASX Corporate Governance Guidelines is not mandatory. What does mandatory mean? Mandatory basically means you have no choice. You've got to follow them, the rules, and there is no choice, there is no flexibility. Comply or explain means that these are the guidelines, follow them. If you don't follow them, you need to explain why you haven't. Okay. So these are the guidelines. If you don't follow them, you've got to explain. Comply. If not, explain why you haven't. It's interesting actually, in the annual reports of companies these days, they actually have a page, where they've explained, so they've got explanations as to, they list out the ASX Corporate Governance Guidelines that they haven't complied with, and then they give an explanation as to why they haven't complied. Do you think that's a problem? Any problem with that, do you think? Basically, I guess you could have companies who kind of find a reason which is not necessarily a good reason, but obviously what's going to happen if shareholders read it and they think, oh, this person's just trying to get away with something, they could have followed the guidelines, but they've just been a bit lazy. So if shareholders read the explanation and they think, oh, this is not a very good reason, then obviously they're going to lose a bit of confidence. Okay. So basically, if you're not going to comply, then you must realize that obviously you have to have a good reason, otherwise the shareholders generally are going to lose a bit of confidence in the company. Okay. Influences on the ASX Corporate Governance Guidelines. We've got, what is influencing the Australian Corporate Governance Guidelines. Basically, American, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Do you do that in auditing? Sarbanes-Oxley. Things like the Corporate Cadbury Report, which is in the UK. So that report there, a lot of UK reports, and obviously the OECD. What does OECD mean and what is it? I think I've mentioned it a few times, but I'll just keep mentioning it so you remember. OECD. What is that? It stands for, anyone guess? No? I haven't got it up there actually. It's organisation, and it's probably one of the main, well, it is the main influence. Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, yeah. International organisation, and what do? They're basically trying to deal with issues such as bribery, for example. The OECD were the first ones that came out with corporate governance guidelines around the year 2000, when all those problems occurred. So they were the lead to do with those guidelines, and all countries around the world generally pretty much take their guidelines and adapt them slightly to the country. Every time the OECD makes changes, then countries will follow their lead. Okay, the principles, I'll come back to a bit later, but you can see that there are 8. They also say that we'll look at those 8 principles in the tutorial as well. A literal approach to applying guidelines is not appropriate. You should follow the spirit of the ASX guidelines. So what do they mean by the spirit and not the literal approach? They want you to follow the spirit and not the literal approach. I guess some people, they say, okay, I'm going to follow the literal approach, and it leads them to do something which is not actually in line with the actual kind of values, okay? So if ever you're going to follow something and you're going to put in place the literal approach, and you're going to say, well look, I followed exactly what is said in these rules, and you do something which looks a bit dodgy, they say, well no, you haven't actually followed the spirit of the governance guidelines. Does that make sense? And you've heard that before, that kind of approach, haven't you? Yeah? Okay, so I'm not going to go through these in too much detail. Okay, basically the board of a listed entity is going to appoint the chair, appoint the CEO, approve the appointment, and replacement of other senior executives. They're obviously providing leadership and setting on strategic objectives. This is all to do with Principle 1. Overseeing management's implementations of strategic objectives, approving operating budgets and capital expenditure, overseeing the integrity of the reporting, making sure that there is timely and balanced disclosure. Risk management, they must have a risk management framework, so this is the board. Okay, they must monitor the effectiveness of the entity's governance practices, obviously. Okay, so there are quite a few things here that the board must do, which you can read through. Principle 2 is to do with structuring the board to add value, so having people on the board that are going to do a good job, basically, I guess. The majority of the board should be independent directors. Okay, can't stress that one enough. Why is that so important? Whenever we've had frauds take place, it's virtually always been because there haven't been enough genuinely independent directors on the board. Okay, mainly because most of the board directors have had too much self-interest, and they've put that self-interest before. They haven't followed their fiduciary duties, which is to actually put the self-interest below that of the company and the shareholders. Okay. Okay, so the chair should be an independent director, and obviously the chair and the chief executive should be the same person. Nomination committee, we've already said, must have 3 members. Majority independent. Okay. Who is independent? So they've added something more to that, box 2.3, so we'll look at that in the tutorial. What's the thing that I mentioned earlier that they've added to who is independent? What do you have to be careful now, a bit more careful about? Can you remember? Sorry, friendships? Yeah, so they've added the whole issue of friendships there, and not only family ties, okay? And then also, just regarding independence, you've got to be careful with someone who's been on the board for 9 years plus. So you've got to assess whether they can still be independent. Do you think you can still be independent when you've been there for 9 years? Sorry? I suppose it's that question of, do you think anyone can be independent? Do you think there are exceptions, perhaps? Clearly a lot of people do think that people can maintain that independence. So it's questionable. I guess you could argue that it might not be possible, but I think it depends on the person generally. Auditors, I suppose that's why they're trying to get people, different auditors coming on board to audit, because I'd say after 9 years you probably have lost that independence being an auditor. Okay, so that length of time generally erodes your independence to some degree. Okay, I'm just going through this very quickly. Ethical and responsible decision making, as I've said. Got to be careful with the whole issue of forced or compulsory labour, respecting human rights, safe and non-discriminatory workplace, honestly and fairly with suppliers, and only dealing with business partners who demonstrate similar ethical and responsible business practices. So this is one of the big things actually, also acting responsibly towards the environment. You've got to be careful of actually dealing with people who are going to attract negative attention in terms of publicity because they're doing the wrong thing. Don't associate. I'm not saying, basically this is what I've seen, that people are actually